Good afternoon, everyone in the room, and whoever else is tuned in online or logged in online. Sounds like a radio tuning. Anyway, thank you, Dr. Cleophas. It's really a privilege to be part of your work and especially the I'm going to use the term roadshow around the book. Not because it's not for marketing purposes, but rather just for spreading. And I think these two books, which are part of a series, I'm going to assume because they have similar covers, it's exploring decolonizing themes. Some of this will be discussed today. And then there's also critical reflections on physical culture at the edges of the empire. So I think why work in this area? Look, sport and politics are inextricably linked, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. And never more so than in South Africa, but all over the world, there's a link between sport and politics. Countries want to excel at the Olympics because it gives their country some kind of prestige, the political system gets prestige, etc., etc. But there is that link. But we've had a link here which is deeply political, and it's linked through separate amenities. It was structured as a policy that sport be separated between what we in South Africa would call races. And unfortunately, the separate amenities were unequally funded. And consequences of these included a lack of opportunities for some people, careers that didn't quite blossom because of a lack of facilities, group areas act also split up communities, split up sport clubs, and so on. And later on, we had unification, which and mergers, which unfortunately, rather than lifting things out, further oppressed certain sport activities and approaches. And this kind of work, which Dr. Cleophas and his group of authors, and his work in particular, are attempts to center and to lift out the marginality of certain sports in South Africa, especially in the Western Cape, to bring those sporting persons, those sporting activities, the history, the political links, to bring it out of obscurity and to foreground the kind of work, this kind of activity of sport in a deeply politicized society, and to talk about its consequences and the achievements in spite of the kind of political setups. Okay, so I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Cleophas, but I'll just briefly introduce him to those logged in who may not know of him. He's been publishing work regularly. He has more than 40 journal articles related to this kind of work, and has been the voice of a lot of sport that has been marginalized and would have gone unnoticed had he not taken on this kind of work. He also has about 10 book chapters. He has these two very important international edited volumes of exploring decolonizing themes in South African sport history, issues and challenges, and critical reflections on physical culture, which I've mentioned earlier. So Dr. Cleophas is also an ex-athlete who at some point held a record in the Western Province Senior Schools organization. I think that record has since been toppled.
Many times.
Oh, many times, he says. But he's still involved. He's still involved, and of course, he's taken on a different role in sport, and he's still a very passionate sports person dealing with many issues and still very interested in sport. Dr. Cleophas, I'm going to hand over to you to do your talk today, exploring decolonizing themes in South Africa.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Eddy. Okay, so as introduction said, thank you all for coming out here this afternoon. Thank you all. This talk is based on the publication that you see there, and it's on the shelf outside here. It was launched about 4 years ago. At the launch, you see there, I think Simon was there at the launch. So from that time, about 4 years ago, I've gained new knowledges, and I've extended on this work, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So, as was mentioned, my chapter in this book deals about the history of track and field athletics, and from the very beginning, from organized athletics, people of color were presented in a certain context, in a certain light during the colonial period. On the left there, it was not uncommon for people of color to be getting nicknames of birds, animals, and so forth in the world of sport. They were never part of the mainstream sport. They were an appendage. Dr. Snyder will talk more about that character. And that comes from the book Mathematics op die rugbyveld. The sport of athletics at Stellenbosch did not escape that. The picture you have there is 1883. That is of the very beginning of the Victoria College Athletic and Cycling Club. If you look carefully there, now unfortunately I don't have a pointer to show, but if you look carefully there, you see the names of the various cyclists. If you look in front in the corner there, if you can just point here, the description of this young boy here, he's young. Now, we don't know what was the circumstances when that photo was taken. It could just have been that young boy just came past and he asked if he could be part of the photo. We don't know. But nevertheless, that was a typical place for people of color without any kind of personality, a young. So Professor Leslie Lagrange says to undo those kinds of things, and this is in the book, he says that decolonizing sport, it presents us with opportunities we have for reconstructing a history of sport, both on the individual level and as a collective identity, is to break down those mythical stereotypes that we have of people. So Professor Andre Oudendal says in order to do this, we need to look for new ways of talking about the past. So we need to go beyond the existing colonial and apartheid created narratives by looking at how sport developed from the very start, to see where does these kinds of stigmatization and these kinds of falsehoods, where did it start? And by so doing, we can include the excluded stories of the past in today's stories. And in order to do that, we have to look at sources outside of sport. I've published on the story of a jockey, Jan Baantjies, I don't have time now to go into the whole story about him. But Jan Bankies was the typical black jockey of the 19th century. He becomes successful, and his final days, he ends up on the street being a drunk. That is the typical life pattern of how people of color are presented in 19th century colonial sports stories. What I'm currently busy with is looking at the novels of a well-known historian. He comes from Stellenbosch, as a man called Dan Slay. Some of you might know him. He trained as a physical educationist at Paul Teachers Training College, and then he came to Stellenbosch to complete his PhD. And he's written a number of novels about the Dutch East India period. And in these novels, there's a number of instances where locals were used, Khoi and San people were used to go and deliver messages, early cases of long distance people runners, very similar to your British coachmen who were used to go and, when the Lord came in his horse and cart, and he's about 1 kilometer away from the gate, then the coachman must jump off so that the horse and cart doesn't stop. The horse and cart can go straight through. So my chapter deals with black athletics in Cape Town prior to 1920, tries to do exactly that, to bring out the kind of hidden stories that is there about black athletics. And I've shown in this chapter that there's a history that is not been recorded that dates back to the 17th century already. Just to go back, there's two standard works. One is a master's thesis by Professor Floris van der Merwe, and one is a PhD done by Dave Coughlin, who discusses the history of athletics also in this period. In the one, there's no account of black people. In the second one, there's an account of black people, but it's an appendage of the main story. So since this book, I'm busy looking at this publication, Genadendal. And in this publication, there's a story of a Khoi man who's not Khoi anymore, but is taken up in the new Western world, a man called Karl Mattei, who was part of what became known as the Genadendal Express. Now, the Genadendal Express were postal men who had to deliver post. And I'm also busy with another publication that talks about what these people had to do. They had to deliver posts from Cape Town to Swellendam, Saldanha Bay within a certain amount of time. Because if the post does not get delivered in a certain amount of time, then the man who deals with the post gets a fine. So I'm looking at the stories and the life stories of people like Karl Mattei, we can call it the Karl Mattei type. So my chapter, okay. Okay, sorry, I was meaning to play that. I was meaning to give me, so my next book chapter that I'm working on comes from this work here to look at if this phenomena of indigenous people who is now used in the colonial society based on their talents and the skills that they used previously and how it impacted on the development of sport. Now the next one is also me talking. So I'm turning to this publication here by this man here called Tita Rosenthal. He's published about 50 books on the history of Cape of the local Cape society, and in this publication he mentions in 1810 Hottentots were carriers of packets or letters as much as what the Christians were. Now, if you don't know the history, these terms might sound a bit offensive to you today, but those were the terms that were used in. So this chapter is still very in the beginning stages, so I don't want to venture too much into making statements and to making judgment calls. So, but one thing is certain. The point I'm going to make was that there's a Karl Mattei type, not only here in the Cape, USA, Australia, South America. So the Karl Mattei type and Professor Venter, in the second book, there's a chapter of a cricket team playing bare feet around about the early 20th century. So a question came up, how has this indigenous cultures impacted on the development of sport today? And it's a challenge also, I think, for sports scientists, not only to look at the way the Western body is depicted in science, but to look at maybe in biomechanics, pre-colonial periods. I remember Tim Noakes once when he gave a talk on an Australian player, Bradman, I think, and he mentioned Bradman's famous swing was the cross swing. The standard English swing is what is called the stroke of the empires on the back foot, and you stroke the ball. Bradman used the cross swing, and Tim Noakes, if I remember correctly, he said he must have borrowed that idea from looking at what the locals do when they were playing. So I hope I can get this. I was going to show you Choctaw football. It's a 3-minute clip. But I don't know if I can get it on here from the internet or not.
Tell us what's it about.
Just stop presenting.
All right.
You will stop presenting.
Okay. But I need to what's called copy that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So where's the
You
slides?
can go to the slide.
It's on what's it? Internet. You.
No, where's the slide?
Slide to get
Where's the slideshow? Your slideshow now.
On the
Okay.
USB.
Okay.
It's
Yeah.
on the USB.
Yeah.
Okay.
Go to the Explorer there.
Open that salon in there. Where is it?
Okay. Can you?
Then you just copy the link.
Sure.
Man is bezig.
Some filing system.
I wonder if they ran backwards between the wickets.
Straks hulle het gevat.
Sien jy?
Sien net.
Okay, is daar.
Kom ek in, Simon.
Unlicensed. That's not bad.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, maybe just go back to your slide.
Tell us about it.
Okay, so there is Choctaw football, maybe in the academy we can look at it. It shows how Native Americans still play the game of Choctaw, but the game of Choctaw is a combination of hockey, lacrosse, rugby, football, soccer. There is basically no laws to the game. Anything goes. Anything goes. So what the colonials did was, in order to bring that kind of activity into the Western colonial world, they brought about laws and things like that. So, but that is a whole different debate. So we have got, in the Western Cape, we have got accounts, at least today, where people is beginning to look at what happened in pre-colonial times and how it's affecting us today, the way we live and the way we don't live also. And I've done that book by June Bram. If you're interested, it's a very interesting book to tell you how from the 17th century there's stories being told up until today of females, especially of the activities and the games women were doing.
Around the galley, something.
Yes. I want to go to the next slide.
That's the last slide.
That's the last slide. So a question that I'm grappling with, how does the colonized, we mentioned, how do they get to be known in society today, agency? So at that point, I want to hand over to Dr. Snyder to speak about his chapter, Subservient Gesture.
Can I get a minute to
Yes.
introduce him?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Hendricks Snyder. I think he was a rugby player as well as an administrator. Are you there, Dr. Snyder?
I'm here.
Okay. He has in excess or more than 30 articles published, 2 books. He's also a museum curator. He was previously the curator of the Springbok Experience Museum and also the Free State Museum. And no stranger to sport history and the kind of work that is represented in these books. So Dr. Snyder, I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation today. Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Thanks, everybody. Just a note before I go. I find myself in the midst of both load shedding and problems with a fiber connection.
That's so dark there.
Yeah, we had quite a couple of issues of misfortune, but be it as it may, my story deals with a individual called Hasan Hendricks Biadin. In our history, he is referred to as Haad. So the story of Haad. Haad is then almost like a stereotype that we see replicated in a number of instances. A little bit of background. Haad made his appearance in the South African sports media during the period, the late 1919 to the 1950s, because of his association with the Springbok rugby team. And I'm not sure, is my slide visible?
No.
Oh, I don't know what's
slide of load shedding. You want to sort of share? Has he got sharing?
Yeah, he started, so I think his connection was not strong enough to share the slides.
Oh no.
Hendrik?
Yes.
Is dit dalk moontlik om vir my die slides te stuur? Of kan dit, ek dink dit gaan ook van ons kan niks sien nie. Yes, okay. It's loading again. It's loading.
Okay.
Okay. It's there now, Hendrik. Slide 1.
Okay. Yeah, so to start again, the long and short of my story is we have this gentleman called Hasan Biadin, who is actually you can call him an obscure character within South African sports history. Yet during his lifetime, up to the 1950s, he was quite frequently mentioned within the white media for his association with the Springbok rugby team. And very often, or as far as you read, there is little reference to his full name and identity. If you page through Paul Dobson's work on South African rugby, for example, there's frequent references to Haad. But the reader is rarely being informed that the person referred to was actually Hasan Hendricks Biadin, a citizen of Cape Town, and a man with multiple identities. The only thing that you hear frequently was that Haad was equal to Newlands, was equal to the Springboks, was equal to Boland, was equal to Western Province. So that interested me tremendously. So I was motivated to look into the whole issue of the persona of Haad with the view to contribute to the debate about historical practices and how sports biographies are written, and especially the lack of black sports biographies. Now, if you encounter an early picture of Haad, you will see him appear in his trademark outfit. Red fez, white overcoat with a tie, but also the other thing that you cannot miss is the fact that when you look at that image in front of you, you will see that there may be 4 front teeth missing, which is a stereotype often associated with the community of the Western Cape called the Cape Coloured. Now, as I've said, there is not a lot known about Hasan Biadin, although he's often here and there mentioned in various rugby histories. For more than 3 decades, he was a close associate of white rugby. He was a public figure, was frequently mentioned in newspapers, but by and large, he was a mystery figure. Some of the media also referred to Haad as player number 16, the man who was always there. When the Springboks take to the field, Haad was there. When Western Province take to the field, Haad was there. So he was regarded as part of the furniture. So due to his periodic appearances in public spaces beyond the media, various intellectuals have commented about Haad, portraying a man of many talents, and as one scribe referred to him as a man of 1,000 stories. So for Andre Odendaal, in his work, Haad, as a result of his close relationship with certain white rugby personalities like Dr. Craven, Broekies Broekhuizen, and Benny Osler, for Andre Odendaal, Haad was a ball boy in the first instance. And secondly, he called Haad a subservient gesture, a clown, somebody that amuses others. And you often wonder, now why would an intellectual like Professor Andre Odendaal see it fit to call this individual a subservient gesture? Now when you read through the different accounts of the life and times of Biadin, you will see him often portrayed as a very humble person who would always defer to his benefactors. When he spoke about the late Dr. Danny Craven, he would always refer to him as Baas Danny. When he referred to Benny Osler, he referred to Baas Benny in the mode of the old South Africa. And probably from that vantage point, Odendaal felt that if you humble yourself, if you have no issue with calling and paying respects to certain white people by calling and referring to them as Baas, you obviously, he surmises that you would have no problem call yourself any other name. So he saw it fit to start to refer to Haad in his work as a subservient gesture. And one are left with the question now, why is it necessary to do to get into name calling? But well-known Cape Times and Cape Argus journalist, the late A.C. Parker, when he referred to Haad in his version of South African rugby history, he talks about Haad as the baggage master of Western Province. So the man who makes sure that the team is fully kitted out and provided for. The late Danny Craven referred to Haad as the masseuse of the Springbok team. So in his interaction with white administrators in the rugby sphere, coaches, players, etc., they each had their own view of who and what Haad is. So Haad also found his way into popular myth. And according to the existing myths, if you read through Dobson's work on South African rugby, he wrote about Haad using his dukoms or Malay tricks to jinx the opposition and ward off bad luck for the home team. Using dukoms, malatrix to jinx the opposition, and to ward off bad luck for the home team. And Dobson goes one step further. He said, Haad was part of the delicious pre-match excitement that preceded a Currie Cup match, a rugby test of the Springboks, an encounter between Western Province and Boland and whoever. And those things stuck in my mind, that it was, Haad was part of the pre-match entertainment, a delicious one on top of it. Secondly, Haad brings to the table malatrix, dukoms, to jinx the opposition team. Now within these statements, there are a lot of very important information. Under the old system, the divide between Christians and Muslims were as wide as the grace of the good Lord. White Afrikaners and even white English had their own idea about what was going on within Muslim or colored society. They saw Muslims as exotic, almost strange and mystic people. But importantly, there was this belief that Muslims are up to a lot of very mysterious tricks that they can use to bring good luck or to bestow bad luck onto you. But the most revealing statement was the idea that they saw Haad as part of the pre-match entertainment. Now, those that works in the field of decolonization, they are of the view that when individuals are portrayed as strange, as exotic, and have no recognizable history, are one-dimensional and without agency, when you see these elements, decolonizing theorists believe that what you are actually witnessing are acts of epistemic violence. When you write me out of history, when you treat me as part of your pre-match excitement and exoticism, you actually are portraying me as one-dimensional, have no history, as a curiosity, and on top of that, if you look at the story of how Haad used his humility, his closeness to white benefactors, always subservient, always paying respects to whoever was white, not even having issues with using derogatory terms or terms that people nowadays regard as insulting, such as boss. They saw Haad as somebody without agency, somebody that willingly subject himself to acts of epistemic violence. But I would like to argue that the issue was much more complicated. Haad was more than the gesture that we see, the gesture that Andre Odendaal referred to. And I want to quickly stop and look at the whole thing of nicknames. John Newright, the American historian and sociologist, argue that when you impose a nickname on somebody, it means you are actually drawing boundary lines. You are actually saying Rabbit or Haad or Tiki or Kojak or even Aasvoel. When you impose a certain nickname on a person, you are actually excluding that person from an inner circle. You treated that person as belonging to the other. So whether that name befits that person is a different matter altogether. It is a dynamic process. It sometimes have a relationship to the unique characteristics of the person, but oftentimes when it's imposed, it is aimed at emphasizing difference, emphasizing otherness, not belonging to this group, not belonging into the circle of friends. But we also know, especially in the world of sport, that nicknames are often terms of endearment and signifies of an athlete's popularity, recognition as an achievement. And in the case of Haad, it is no different. If you deal with Tendai Beast and Bakkies Botha today, nicknames in this context are brand names. Bakkies is a brand name. Beast is a brand name. Names that are worth a lot of money in the modern professional context. In the context in which Haad operated, nicknames were frequently imposed to distinguish the dominant group from the subservient group. To declare that the Hamater doesn't belong in the circle, that only the Kooses belong in the circle, that only the Bennies belong in the circle. But the Aasvoels, the Kojeks, the Hamads belong somewhere else. So, in the case of Haad, his nickname never evolved into a brand name that could potentially be of great monetary value. Although there are hints that Haad and his nickname has started to develop the features of a modern brand. Haad also found its way, and his demeanor also found its way into the Afrikaans literature of the 1930s and 40s. Because Haad was so closely associated with the Springboks and rugby, a character similar to Haad found its way into the books of I.D. du Plessis. Now, I.D. du Plessis wrote a series of books depicting the battles between the Springboks and the New Zealand All Blacks. And in his book, there is this character called Abdul. Now, Abdul or Abdul is traditionally connected with people from the Muslim community. So it is then safe when you take Abdul and how he is displayed and illustrated within the context of I.D. du Plessis' Springbok book series. Abdul is also a subservient Malay rugby fan who is very close to Baas Willie Venter. And their relationship is based on Willie calling him Abdul and Abdul calling him Baas Willie. And there is for Abdul no greater honor than to carry the boots and the rugby gear of his boss to the Newland Stadium and back. So when you read through the Springbok book series, you ask yourself, did Haad serve as a model for the character of Abdul? Did Haad's demeanor and supposed lack of agency, did that serve as a model for the characterization of Abdul? Or was there another figure that feed into the character of Abdul? But I.D. du Plessis was not the only man who wrote about Malays and about rugby. Topsy Smith, who wrote the stories of Trompie and the Boksombende, also wrote a series of books for teenagers in the 1940s. And he also looked at the Springboks, he also looks at rugby, and he created a character called Tokolosi, But within the Springbok and Tokolosi series, there was also a Haad-like figure, meaning a black person, very humble, almost subservient, and also Malay. And Topsy Smith, like I.D. du Plessis, at least I.D.'s character got a name like Abdul. In Topsy's work, he referred to all Malay rugby supporters as the Hamate. So Haad, or the term Hamate, becomes a collective to describe a group of people that were not white, that were not supposedly playing the game, and a group of people that when you look at them, supposedly, you cannot distinguish between them as individuals. So he called all Muslim rugby supporters in Cape Town at the time the Hamate. And the commonality between Du Plessis and Topsy Smith's character is that none of those figures displayed any agency. They are subservient, they are too humble, the relationship between them and their white patrons are unequal, and there is this strong sense of deferment. They use the free use of terms like Baas Willie, Baas Dani, Baas Broekies, etc., etc. And it almost creates a situation where when people saw Haad with his red fez, his white overcoat, entering Newlands, they saw him as the start of the fun and game. They saw him as part of the exotic entertainment, which...
Dr. Snyder?
Yes.
You need to start rounding up, please.
Yes, will do. The reality is, the historical Haad was actually an individual called Hasan Hendricks, a successful businessman in the Somerset West community, a devoted Muslim, and a man fully in charge of his own future, who uses his own resources to move between rugby games, to support his team, who uses his skill as a tailor to become the tailor to the Western Province and the Springboks for 50 years. So it almost gets a sense that this man used his subservience for business purposes, using native agency, pretending almost that he is subservient to his white patrons, while all the time cashing in through his tailor business from Western Province and the Springboks for almost half a century. So, but we also find behind the layers, if you lift the layers, you find an avid sportsman, a walking champion, a trophy holder during the 1920s and 1913. Totally different from the Haad that Paul Dobson regarded as part of the exotic pre-match entertainment. So what does I learn from that? Any individual has multiple identities. Every person has agency. And we shouldn't simply write people off because for us, they appear to be subservient. They appear to be overtly obedient. There is indicators of deferment. There's indicators of even toleration of insulting terminology. It may be a way of maneuvering and managing and moving between the realities of the social existence and its challenges, while all the time having enough mental and other resources to exploit the situation to the full. So what Haad learns me, be careful, don't judge a book by its cover. And that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder, and thank you, Dr. Cleophas. Colleagues, I think we have a few minutes for one or two questions or comments. Colleagues who are connected online, or anybody in the room wish to pose, Professor Clark.
Just a comment, and then maybe Dr. Cleophas or Dr. Snyder can respond. So we spoke earlier, Dr. Cleophas, about it's important that stories needs to be told. There's a lot of stories, rugby, which Dr. Snyder is doing. There's a lot of athletics that you're doing. But what is the current state about stories in sports like netball, hockey, all your other sports, and how do you see it going forward, and how do you create a platform for that stories to be told? I think both of you can help.
Okay, let's start with Dr. Cleophas.
Yeah, okay. Well, the obvious reason is one only has two hands, so you can't get to all of that. But the history of sports shows us that the modern day sport didn't come from Britain. Britain formalized things, yes, but Britain took things from various parts of the world. So rugby, for example, in the sports history textbook that we've got a history of how that game came from Britain, it came from China, but the Native Americans, I was going to show that video, the Native Americans played a version of football, rugby football, the Latin Americans played a version of football, the local Khoi people by us, they played a version of football, of passing the ball. So various groups around the world. So we need to have an international view of sport history. The old way was to look at Britain, and from there to look at the history. That is from my point.
Well,
the other coasts are like hockey and netball, which is also.
Are people working on them?
Yeah.
Our people, yes. Dr. Snyder and myself, we just published journal articles now on the history of netball. Dr. Snyder has published on lacrosse. And there are people doing work on soccer. So yes, there are other people.
Okay. And in addition to that question, because I know you present these stories in the form of articles and books, but what other platforms, so that we can reach the masses, do you suggest we use in order to tell these stories?
Do you want to maybe talk about the surplus book launch?
Yeah, I can say there are other forums that have regular meetings, and where this kind of thing is put into a, if I can call it, a more popular form, which is, I think, what you're talking about. That's more accessible. And that kind of work is probably where dissemination would happen on a bigger scale. I wonder if you should bring in Dr. Snyder. You want to make a comment, perhaps, or?
Yeah, I think the reality is that because a lot of South African sports federations, because of our apartheid past, seems to be scared of the original archives of that past. And I know of incidences where people have physically dumped those information on garbage dumps. And if you look at websites and Facebook pages and all of that of some of these bodies today, there's a tendency to only want to write the history of South African sports from unity in 1992. The sad thing is, there is not enough historians interested in writing the history of South African sports. So what you have seen is a proliferation of social media as a platform for people's sports history and community sports history. And maybe that is a field that professional historians and others should actively look into as to how do we optimize the space that social media platforms presents us. Also to elevate the status of social media for scientific research. Because currently everybody said, don't ask Dr. Google. Dr. Google may cheat you. May mislead you. But if you look at some of these Facebook pages, for example, they are beginning to fill a critical space in the absence of interested historians dealing with the issues and the issues of our sporting past. For example, I'm an active follower of baseball's Facebook pages because this is one of my current projects. In the absence of original archives, those oral renditions that we find there seems to be the only additional source, especially for black baseball. So I think we should use more of these platforms and we should contribute to enhancing their status and to elevate their usefulness as means of scientific platforms.
Okay.
Can I just say something? There is a chapter in the first book about social media as a source for South African cycling history.
Okay. We just got to give 2 hands in the chat box and then 1 person in the room. Where do we start with? Vanessa, I see your hand there.
Yes, thank you, Professor Reddy, for the chat, and Dr. Cleophas and Dr. Hendricks for the inputs and the interesting topics. I'm not sure if mine is a question or perhaps just a statement around history.
That's fine.
I think for me, perhaps the question lies in not necessarily sport history, but history in general. And we've seen it being removed from our schools, and hopefully, thankfully, it's coming back into our schools again soon, hopefully. But I think that's where it lies, that there's a concentration currently on STEM subjects, and the social sciences and history subjects are being removed from our schools or not concentrated on enough. So I think for me that if we can answer that question, or we can reintroduce history and social sciences into our curriculums and into our modules and subjects, then I think we're going to reintroduce a love for history again, and then perhaps again encourage people to write about sport. Thank you, Professor Reddy.
Thank you. And I think in this room, it's probably a big issue, the removal of physical culture from the school curriculum. It was always a big issue. We give the lady in the room a chance, and then I'll come back to Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Cleophas. Yeah, so I was like coming from like more quantitative background in science. I was wondering, how many times do you have actual interviews with these people? Because I mean, there's a lot being said about Haad and his story, but it's not. Was there at any time an interview with him to portray him in this way? And then, yeah, I'm saying this out of a place of being a disabled person, and a lot of times a lot is being said about us, and I appreciate the gesture because I see the passion of people wanting to stand up for us, but I also feel like, why don't you speak to me? Why don't you ask me? And then I can speak for myself. But I know there's also like, I love the passion that you want to like speak these stories, but I was wondering if there's like people still there to like have interviews with, maybe like to get like a full picture.
You can answer them?
Yeah, okay, I'll give a short answer and then I'll answer. Well,
Okay, 2 brief answers.
okay, so, well, in a very short nutshell, Dr. Snyder spoke about Hamate, and I spoke about the Kalmate type. Now, in history, I am a Kalmate type. In history, I am a Hamate. So that gives me license to be saying certain things. I'm very careful of describing people, other people, because I know I don't always come from that background and I don't always understand that. So with regard to Kalmate that I'm busy with, I take license because I am a Kalmate type. I'm the type what Dr. Snyder spoke about now. So that is why I take certain license. I don't know, Dr. Snyder, do you want to say something shortly?
No, I fully agree with your input there. I however also agree with the question about the importance of involving those that we write about where it is possible, because we also find ourselves in an era of commercialization where nobody wants to give information for free. Everybody, there's a huge movement towards commodifying my story. And I'm beginning to pick up increasingly so that even the most marginalized whose histories were excluded from the official record, they are not happy, pardon me, to simply share. So those are some of the emerging challenges now. But yeah, it's always advisable to do what we do with the full cooperation and involvement of the subject as a manner of speaking.
Okay, thank you. Malcolm, over to you to be our last question or comment. And thank you for joining.
And thank you, Chris, for sharing, and Francois and Hendrik for interesting discussions. I just wanted to come back and provide a bit that might add to some answer to the initial question about how we might disseminate or broadcast some of this info, and I think it's one of the key things that we as historians are not particularly good at doing. It seemed, and I wanted to make a couple of comments and note one really good example that's doing some of that stuff in very interesting ways. I think as historians, we probably need to get better at talking with people like curriculum development staff or museum curators about the kinds of formats that are useful to them in the for the outputs that we're producing from our research. What's the information they need? What kind of formats can it come to them in as teachers and as publicly engaged peoples to get those histories out there? And the anecdote that I wanted to give is a case that does that very well, and it's a Canadian example, where we're a group of scholars primarily working with Vicky Parashak at Windsor University and Taylor McKee now at I've forgotten where Taylor's gone, who responded to one of the calls from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission to uncover Indigenous sports history by working with their students to develop a series of about 40 or 50 biographical Wikipedia pages that identify particular First Nations, Métis and Inuit athletes, very often in the public eye, but not known as First Nations, Inuits or Métis athletes, and telling the stories of these athletes as First Nations peoples, as Indigenous peoples, as a way to disrupt that dominant colonial narrative that runs through Canadian sports history. And it seems to me that it's a really interesting project that engages with media platform that we as scholars have traditionally been really skeptical about, Wikipedia, and used it in a way that is scholarly powerful but engages those public audiences and broadcasts scholarly work in an incredibly accessible way. It's absolutely worth looking at, and it's an example to me of that kind of cunning use of media forms that we're quite skeptical about to make them more rigorous and more useful, and to broadcast scholarly work in really useful ways. Just an anecdote, a really useful instance, I think, of doing some of that work. And I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Colleagues, I think we're going to conclude there for today. We've unfortunately run out of time. Thank you to the two presenters. Thank you for those who attended and for all the inputs. And thank you again for choosing to do this kind of work and to foreground what is often unheard voices in not only South Africa, but in globally. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.